Okay, welcome everyone to our This or That webinar, what we're calling a series. You do have to register for each one individually, but today we are going to specifically be looking at trees and more specifically common trees that are confused with one another. And that's looking just at our native tree species. We will touch a little bit on some potentially invasive species as well. And we're not getting into landscape plants or anything like that. That's outside my area of expertise. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lara Milligan. I am the Natural Resources Agent. I work for UF IFAS Extension here in Pinellas County. And just quick background, I not only work for the University of Florida, but I also attended the University of Florida. I did my undergrad and master's there in natural resource conservation and forestry with a focus on environmental education and communication. And I'm also a graduate of the Florida Natural Resources Leadership Institute, which I highly, highly recommend. I'm going to go over just some logistics before we jump into the actual presentation. As part of the University of Florida, we are funded partially through the USDA. And as such, we are required to not discriminate in any way, shape, or form. And so if you have any issues, complaints, concerns, you can contact them. And you could honestly just do a search online for discrimination complaint form, and you can file that there. I'm required to say that. So more specifically, I know Zoom is always changing, so this might not be exactly what you see on your screen, but generally you should have an audio settings feature somewhere on your computer. So if you're having issues hearing me, just make sure you have the right speaker selected, and you can adjust volume and things from that. You will also see a Q&A box on your screen. That is where, if you have a question during my presentation, please click on that and type it in there. And that catalogs them for me to review, and we will go over those at the end so I can focus on my presentation. Please feel free to interact via chat. I will also be interacting with you via chat, so you can have that open if you care to participate in that way. I probably won't be doing any other interactions, but other than through the chat. So in the field guide that we created, which is where this presentation really was inspired from, there are 14 different tree comparisons. I'm only going to be doing 6 today. So it's like a little teaser. If you want more, then you'll have to purchase the guide or stay tuned for a future This or That webinar series. So the trees we will be comparing today, we're going to do cabbage palm versus saw palmetto, bald and pond cypress, longleaf and slash pine, live oak, laurel oak, red bay, sweet bay, and red mangrove and black mangrove. These are probably the most common ones that are confused, which is why these are the ones that we are featuring today. Again, this is inspired by a field guide literally called This or That, hence the title of this webinar. So you can purchase this field guide through the UF IFAS bookstore. It is also available for sale at Brooker Creek Preserve. They have a nature store inside. So if you want to skip on the shipping costs, you can do a little staycation trip up to Brooker Creek Preserve if you don't live nearby. So with that, we are going to jump right in. I will let you know that I am only working on one screen today. So if you guys are interacting or anything via chat, I won't be able to see that unless I intentionally open it up when I ask you a question. So the first species comparison we are going to look at is cabbage palm versus saw palmetto. Again, common names, right? They're both palms. These are 2 native palm species that we have here, but they're very, very different. And we're going to explain how to tell them apart. So the first thing that you want to look at if you're come across this species and you're like, which one is it? Or what is this? You can look at what we call the petiole, which is basically the leaf stem or the little stick that connects the leaf to the rest of the plant. If you want to be fancy, you can call it a petiole. On the cabbage palm, the petiole is very smooth. If you were to rub your fingers along the sides of the cabbage palm, no problem. Do the same thing on the saw palmetto. Might need a band-aid after that. Very, very sharp, tiny little spikes along the edge of the petiole, hence the common name saw palmetto. Another thing you can look for, if that's not obvious or you don't feel like maybe getting your finger pricked, you can just look at where the petiole enters the leaf. So in this case, this is again on the cabbage palm on the left. You can see the petiole, if you follow it all the way up into leaf, it kind of comes up to a point. It goes up and extends into the palm frond, which we'll talk more about on the next slide. Compare that to, or contrast that to, the petiole of the saw palmetto, which you can see runs right up, and when it hits the rest of the palm frond, it just abruptly stops. So that's another way that you can tell these two apart. Now, that plays into the appearance of the palm frond itself. So again, remember on the cabbage palm, it extends up into the leaf. And because it goes up and through the leaf, it basically causes the frond to have a little bit of a folded or curved appearance, which you can really see on your screen here. This curve is that petiole going through the palm frond, compared to, again, it stops abruptly on the saw palmetto, and there's a much stiffer kind of rigid appearance of the palm frond on the saw palmetto. And again, this is when they're both young and could easily be confused because they're kind of at the same level. Another thing you can look for with the cabbage palm is these little, I tried to highlight it, in these golden strings or strands that kind of peel off from the leaf. That is a key characteristic with the cabbage palm that is absent on the saw palmetto. Now, as I kind of alluded to with the cabbage palm, here we are talking about it grows into a tree. So of course, if you're looking at this versus a saw palmetto that's on the ground, it's very easy to say, oh, this is the cabbage palm because it grows into a tree. So, but if you're ever still unsure, single trunk is indicative with the cabbage palm compared to saw palmettos, which typically have multi-trunk system. So you can see that here. I included a picture of saw palmetto after a prescribed burn because it's a lot easier to see these multi-stems of the saw palmetto. So that's really common with them. They can grow in the absence of fire pretty tall, up to about 20, 25 feet. Hopefully we're not seeing that much height because we're having regular prescribed burns, regardless of where you're tuning in from. But again, they can get pretty tall. So that's again where it could maybe be a little bit confusing. But hopefully now with all these tips and tricks, you can tell these two apart. Now I will say there's also another, I feel like more common, not more common than the other, but it's becoming more common species of palm called the Chinese fan palm, which is on like the watch list in terms of invasive species status. So you can see it looks like any other palm tree. If you focus again in on the petiole, you can see this is like, this puts the saw palmetto to shame. These are like massive teeth along the edge of the petiole on the Chinese fan palm. This is more in the younger fronds. Once it becomes mature, those tend to be not as obvious or less noticeable in appearance. Also on the frond itself, it tends to have a lot more what we'd call like segments, those little kind of rays that stick out and make the palm frond what we know as a palm frond. They tend to have a lot more of the segmentation, 60 to 100. And you can kind of know, I tried to find pictures that highlight this, but they kind of like droop at the tips. So you can kind of see that in this picture here and also in the larger tree picture. So kind of just like fold at the tips of the frond. So we base all of our assessments with invasive species by the UF IFAS assessment tool. So this is currently listed as a caution species, which means, again, we're like weary, this might become invasive, and are to manage to prevent it from escape from where it is currently located. So this is where I'll do your first pop quiz. You can pull up the chat if you care to participate and type in. It's true, false. We're starting off easy here. 50-50 chance. The cabbage palm is Florida's state tree. Oh, I just gave it away. Did I give it away? Maybe you didn't see that. I'm going to open the chat now and see. Okay, mixed responses so far. And this is not a trick question. Okay. Thank you guys for interacting. This is great. Okay, I've seen both answers. Again, you had a 50-50 chance. I did jump the gun and hit the next slide. So this is true. It is our state tree, cabbage palm, also called sable palmetto. That's the scientific name. It is our state tree. You will often hear people say, it's not really a tree. That's not really true. There's not, honestly, a true botanical definition of a tree. But if you, like we do this with our 4-H youth, we say, if you were to describe a tree to an alien from outer space, like how would you explain a tree? And you'd say, well, it gets really big. It has one trunk. It grows really tall. So generally speaking, yes, cabbage palm would fit the criteria of a tree. I was brought up in the thinking of if it's over 4 inches in diameter, that classifies it as a tree. Either way, if you were to describe that to somebody, you would say it's a tree. So we're calling it our state tree. Now, on to our next comparison. This is our cypress trees. So we have the bald cypress and the pond cypress. We are now classifying them as two separate species. When I was trained, they were different variations of the same species. For today's purposes, two separate species. The main way we can tell these apart is just by looking at the leaf appearance and leaf shape. So pond cypress, which is on the top, we like to say is more needle-like. The little kind of feathery awns, if you want to call it, of the leaf are kind of folded up along the midrib of the leaf. Whereas the bald cypress, you can see it's more fanned out. We tend to say this is more of like a feather-like leaf in terms of its appearance. Now, I will say with pond cypress, when they are young, their leaves will be fanned out like this. It's not till they get a little bit more mature that they have this folded appearance. So again, we want to look for some of these other things that I'm going to touch on. Habitat is another helpful indicator. So typically speaking, of course, we can't always say always when we're talking about things in nature, but generally speaking, bald cypress are found in more of moving water bodies. So think rivers, large rivers, creeks where there's a flowing body of water, whereas pond cypress, hence the common name, tend to be found in a little bit more isolated, stagnant waters, hence ponds, and isolated wetlands and things like that. Now, another interesting thing you can look at is the cypress knees, and we won't get into their purpose because still nobody knows what purpose they serve. But in terms of their appearance, the bald cypress tend to have taller knees that are more conical in shape. They kind of come to more of a point, and they're covered in a very thin bark. Compared to the pond cypress knees, which you can see they're not as pointed, they're a little bit more rounded. They tend to be smaller. So generally speaking, they say over like 16 inches puts you in the bald cypress category. Anything smaller than that, pond cypress, again, generalization, I wouldn't like definitely say just by size, but some of these other characteristics. And then also they tend to have a little bit of a thicker bark on the top of the knee. Okay, that was it. I thought I had one more slide for the cypress, but hopefully that's helpful. Cypress are unique in that they are conifers. Typically, you think of conifers being evergreen. However, cypress are special in that they do lose their leaves. So again, you don't always have those leaves to look at. They do often kind of retain them down at the base of the tree after they fall off. So if you can't see them on the tree, you can always look on the floor and see if that's helpful. Now our next comparison are two pine species. We only have 3 in Pinellas County, so this is a good one to learn. So we have the longleaf pine and the slash pine are the two we're going to compare and contrast here. The first thing that you can look at or look for are the needles, and there's a couple different things that we're going to look at. First is how many are in each bundle. So you can see it's obvious in both, but they're kind of all held together at the base. We call this a bundle or a fascicle of needles. And the number of needles that are within that are helpful in identification. So in the case of longleaf pine on the left, they are most often found in sets of 3. And occasionally we're seeing more so just at Brooker Creek Preserve. We found a lot that also have 4. That's not commonly found. More so you're going to see them in sets of 3. Now over to the slash pine, you can see I have here featured a pair of 3 and 2. And these are found again on the same tree species. You'll see them in both 3 and 2. More often it's 2, but you will also see 3 on there, and much more commonly than the 4 on the longleaf pine. So if you're seeing 2, that's like helpful. And okay, that's a slash pine because you won't see 2 on a longleaf pine. Size is also helpful. Longleaf pine gets its common name for a reason. They can be incredibly long. Anywhere from 10 up to 18 inches. So that's very, very long. The slash pine, on the other hand, up to 12 inches. So there is a little bit of an overlap there, but generally speaking, if you're finding a very long needle on a pine tree, it's going to put you into the longleaf pine category. And I just emphasize this here. If you find one in a set of 4, that's like a 4-leaf clover, that's your lucky charm. Put it in your pocket, take it home, and celebrate. It's fun. We do that on our guided hikes at the preserve, except we ask people to leave them there at the preserve. Another thing that you can look for, this is a little bit harder, it takes a little bit more practice, but is the appearance of the bark. And this, I will say, is on mature trees. When they're young, all bets are off. When they're mature on the longleaf pine, they have a much more, I call it irregular appearance. You can see these large blocks, or what we would call plates, but they're kind of like shaggy within that. It's like a reddish brown color, but much more irregular pattern compared to these. Again, you can see these large plates on the slash pine, but they're smooth plates. So I'm hoping you can kind of tell that apart, like these more shaggy, irregular appearance versus this larger, smoother plates on the slash pine, which tends to be a little bit more orange, brown, if you want to get into colors. But they're both this flaky looking appearance overall, which is a fire adaptation, which I won't get into today. Now, cones. If this image on the left is going to bother you because it's upside down, just stay with me. There's a reason I did that. So cones are also helpful. Again, if you don't have needles or you're unsure on the size or how many are in each bundle or fascicle, you can look at the cones. What we're looking at here specifically are the female cones, what we often think of when we think of pine cones. With longleaf pine, they're often held upside down on the tree. So that's why I put it here. I also included that other image to show you that they're often held upside down. Slash pine, upside down, sideways, upright, they're all held by the tree in various different ways. The main takeaway probably again is size. With longleaf pine, we're getting up to like 10-inch cones. Again, these are massive, massive cones. The slash pine, 6 inches maybe. So much, much smaller cone. The color, I couldn't find like the best picture to really emphasize this, but the slash pine cones are this beautiful, beautiful, like shiny tan color. Longleaf pine cones are kind of this like drab brown. So those couple things can be helpful as well. Okay, and this is my bonus for you. I didn't learn this till after my dendrology course, which would have been very helpful. Dendrology is just the study of forest plants. So I do this on my guided hikes. I make people hold up their hand like this, thumb and pinky. You can do this now, like nobody can see you, so it's fine. So you can hold up your hand like this. And if you're unsure, you can look at where, at the twig, right where the needles start to emerge from the tree. And you want to look at the thickness or diameter of that portion of the twig. With longleaf pine, again, everything's bigger, fatter, longer on longleaf pine. So when you're doing this, if you look up and it looks more like the thickness of your thumb, that's going to put you in the longleaf category. If it's skinnier, like your pinky, you can see this is a very skinny twig, that's slash pine. Okay. Hopefully y'all are with me. If anyone did this in the privacy of your own home, good job. Now, another thing to keep in mind, I know probably most of you guys are tuning in from Pinellas County, but if you are ever in South Florida, longleaf pine's natural range does not extend into South Florida. So that can be helpful. If you're down in South Florida, you're like, oh, well, I don't have to, it's not longleaf pine. I can pretty much guarantee that. Of course, there's always exceptions. Slash pine, you can see, does extend into South Florida more along the coast. And then I threw in another bonus because I mentioned there's only 3 pine species. So I was like, well, while I have them, I might as well tell them about the third. So the third species that we have that's naturally occurring here is the sand pine. Sand pine looks nothing like our other pines, which is why I didn't include it in the comparison. The needles or bundles or fascicles are only in sets of 2, which you can see here. And they have a much more, you can even see in this picture, like a spindly, kind of wiry appearance. They're not very rigid and stiff. The overall structure of the tree is very, very different as well. It does not, if you think of a pine tree in your head, you're probably thinking, canopy at the top and then this massive trunk with no twigs or branches extending down the bottom or base of the tree. Not with sand pine. They do retain their lower branches, so they look very, very different. This is like our native Christmas tree that some people purchase because it does retain that appearance of what we commonly think of with a Christmas tree. Much, much smaller cones. Overall, everything here much smaller with the sand pine, and only found really in high elevation areas in Pinellas County. Okay, this is probably, I would say, is the most common one that I get questions about, which is our oak species. Specifically looking at, is this a laurel oak? Is this a live oak? So we're going to dive into that now. first thing is these trees, while they are what we call tardily deciduous, which means they lose their leaves, but later than everybody else. If you are able to get a hold of the leaf, you wouldn't even, if you were to just do this even with your eyes closed, just the texture of how these leaves feel can be helpful. The live oak leaf is a very thick, leathery leaf, especially if it's really dry. You could literally you'd hear an audible crack. It's that thick and leathery. Laurel oak is a very, very thin leaf, very, very smooth. Color could be helpful on the live oak. They do have fine hairs on the underside, so the underside of the leaf has a little bit of like a dull green gray appearance. The laurel oak is vibrant green on both sides. It's a little bit different color green on the underside, but very, very bright. Doesn't have any hairs. And you can see overall the leaf shape of laurel oak, they're going to be a little bit more of an elongated leaf compared to kind of a more rounded, stout leaf of the live oak. If you don't have access to leaves, or you're unsure even with the leaves, you can also look just at the bark of a tree. This is something that I stress anytime I do tree identification. With plants, we don't have bark to look at. Bark alone can be literally the only thing that you have to identify a tree in some situations. So it can be really, really helpful and something that I think is often overlooked. So on the left is the bark of the live oak, which is very, very rough, deeply fissured or deeply furrowed, we like to say. Laurel oak, you can see it's broken up, but it's generally speaking much smoother bark, kind of more shallow fissures compared to that of the live oak. Then if you have acorns either on the tree or beneath the tree that they have fallen off, the acorns, they're same color when they're mature, they kind of turn this beautiful brown. The live oak leaf is much more oblong. It's a longer acorn compared to that of the laurel oak, which is kind of a flattened, stout acorn and has not as much of a shiny appearance as that of the live oak. Okay, this is a segue into my next species comparison. Another true false, I'll open my chat. So, true or false, trees that have similar common names, and I can't see because there's something cut off on my screen, but they are means that they are related taxonomically. Is this true or false? Oh, see, you guys are good. You got this one. This is just really for me to keep it interactive. But you guys are correct. That is false. And that's the issue with common names. If you guys know some botanists or other people in forestry that only speak in the Latin name, there is a reason for that. It just eliminates lots of confusion. So the species that we're going to be comparing today are the red bay and the sweet bay tree, not related in any way, shape, or form, as you can see by the by the scientific name and by the overall appearance, which we're just going to dive into a little bit more. This is one that's more of a misnomer just because of the common name, not necessarily because they look alike, although maybe just specifically with the leaves, which we're going to show right here. So here, I know it's not super obvious, the leaf on the left is from the red bay tree, and on the right is the sweet bay. This is the underside of the leaf. So they both have a very dull appearance on the underside. The red bay is, you can see it's a dull green, but not anything like, they call it like a silvery blue that's on the underside of the sweet bay tree. Both of these leaves, when crushed or rubbed, are very aromatic, so that, I mean, unless you learned the two different smells could be helpful, but that alone is not helpful in identification. One other thing you can look for is the red bay gets there's a specific wasp that creates galls on the red bay, specifically the red bay. And so you can also look for the appearance of like these little warts or growths, whatever you want to call them. These are galls. And this is just a response of the plant to the insect laying eggs inside the leaf. And so that sometimes just the presence of those, you can be like, oh, that's a red bay tree. So that's something that you can also look for. Flowers, again, I know that these are not to scale. So the flower of the red bay tree is a little bit like yellowy, greenish white, but it's about the size of like my thumbnail. So very, very small flower compared to sweet bay. If you remember, if the genus was in Magnolia, so it's in the Magnoliaceae family. And if you know of Southern Magnolia that have the beautiful, beautiful big white flowers, same here with Sweet Bay. Very white, showy, very aromatic flower. So these two, again, really look nothing alike when they are compared in scale. And if none of those is helpful and you have access to the fruit of these species, these also look very, very different. Red Bay has a beautiful, it's like a purplish blue drupe. It's a one-seeded fruit compared to, again, if you're familiar with Southern Magnolia, they have a similar fruiting body. It's a cone-like structure that holds these bright, bright red seeds. Okay, check how we're doing on time. Okay, perfect. This is our last species comparison, and then I'm just gonna list out some resources and shoot a little poll at you guys, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So the last species comparison we are gonna do is two commonly found mangroves in Pinellas County. So we have red mangrove and black mangrove. There's also white mangrove, but we're not gonna include them today. So generally speaking, location from shore can be helpful. So red mangroves are most often found right along the edge of the shore. And that is because their seed is basically a little living plant that drops in the water and then gets carried around. And that's how it reproduces and lands somewhere else. So it's critical to its reproduction. Black mangroves, their seeds need to land on dry land in order to grow and reproduce. So they tend to be found a little bit more inshore. Not always the case. I've seen some right on the shore, but generally speaking. The roots of these, very, very different. You'll often hear people refer to red mangrove roots as having prop roots. They're also called red mangroves because their roots tend to have a reddish appearance to them. The black mangroves also have very, very unique adaptations to living in a very wet environment. So these are the root structures of the black mangroves. These are called pneumatophores, and they assist with air and air exchange excuse me, for the environment that they are found in. If you were to look at the actual leaf themselves, they're both kind of pale on the underside, dark on the top. The key thing you want to look for, feel for, taste for, on the underside of the black mangrove, it is covered in dense hairs. You can kind of see that in this image here. It's kind of this lighter white color. That's because it's covered in fine hairs. If you want, one thing that we were taught in my dendrology class is to use your tongue, only if you know what species you are possibly looking at and it's not poison ivy. You can use your tongue because it's very, very good at assisting with detecting hairs, much more so than your fingers, but also if you need to do something with taste. So black mangroves exude salt. It's another adaptation for the environment they live in through the top of their leaves. So you can lick the leaf, and if it tastes salty, that puts you in the black mangrove category. Okay, we did it right on time. I like to aim to keep these short for lunch and learn. I'm just gonna, again, we always like to wrap up any extension program that we do with, ways that you can help. So with trees, removing invasive, I don't know why it's advancing by itself, removing invasive tree species, planting natives, any restoration event that you can participate in. There's specialty license plates that you can purchase that would support conservation. You can reach out to your elected officials or just generally get involved with tree planting or tree conservation in any way, shape, or form. We also have a blog site where I have tried to take our field guide to the next level, also make it accessible to folks who maybe can't purchase the field guide. And so if I kind of elaborate from what is in the field guide and put them in blog form, you can find those on our blog site at blogs.ifas.ufl.edu. We also have webinars just like this and tons more on our YouTube channel. If you just do a search for Pinellas County Extension YouTube, you can find anything that you want related to the environment. And if you don't see it, let us know. Maybe we can create it for you and watch it on demand at your leisure. I have also created within our YouTube channel a playlist specific to this or that, which again basically takes specific species comparisons and puts them in a 2 to 3 minute video. If you just need a quick refresher or want to share that with family or friends, you can do it that way. We don't have them all yet, but it's a work in progress. Again, you can purchase the field guide if you are interested. I do not benefit in any way, shape, or form from this personally. It goes into my programmatic fund, so it supports more environmental natural resource programming in Pinellas County. And if you're interested, if you're into podcasting, I do have a podcast called Naturally Florida. We would love to have you as a listener. We only do 1 episode a month, so it's not anything crazy or overwhelming. 15 to 20-minute episodes, great for commutes or doing the dishes or doing laundry. So you can scan the QR code or just do a search on your podcast platform of choice for Naturally Florida. So with that, I promised I would launch a poll for you. If you're still with me, thank you. And we'd really appreciate your response to the poll. And once you complete that, while you're doing that, I'm gonna look at the chat. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A box on your screen. Okay, I see. I'm gonna just start answering while you guys are completing the poll. So Lynn asked, is there also a water oak? Yes, there are many. I should probably do a whole presentation just on oaks. There's several species of oaks that we have here. Water oak can easily be identified by kind of 2 main features or characteristics. They have what we call a spatulate shaped leaf, where it's very, very wide at the tip of the leaf. And it comes I don't know if y'all can see this, but it's it literally looks like this. Very, very distinct leaf shape. And also if you flip over the leaf and you look, there's little, what we call veins on the underside of the leaf. If you look at where the 2 veins kind of intersect, there's what we call, if you're still with me, this is your fun for the day, what we in-house call hairy armpits. So there's little tiny patches of hairs where the veins intersect. If you're still ever unsure, feel free to, I'm actually going to go to the next slide. You guys can always shoot me a picture and to my email, and I can help with identification that way. Okay. All right, and let me see. Okay, everyone, thank you. Everyone did the poll. Perfect. Okay. And now I'm gonna open Q&A. Okay, yes, and I don't know if any of my staff around that could share the links easily and quickly in the chat for the blog site. I will do that also while or do I have it on this slide? Let me see. No, you can find it from our main extension website as well, but let's see. So if you go to blogs.ifas.ufl.edu, oh, thank you, Julia put it in there. So she just put a link to our YouTube channel, and then from blogs.ifas.ufl.edu, which I know is a mouthful, you can navigate by county. So you can find Pinellas County. And then if you are only interested in natural resources, you can find my blogs. And there's a way you can subscribe just to each individual blogger based on your interests. So, and that's statewide. There's extension in every single county in the state. So you can be overwhelmed with blogs if you want. And I don't see any other questions. So I will stick around for a couple more minutes, but otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining me. If you want to learn about commonly confused mammals, which you might be like, what are you possibly going to talk about? Then join me next Tuesday, same time, 12:15, lunch and learn. I'd love to have you, or tell family and friends, and have a great rest of your day.